Thank you for joining us. This webinar will begin in just a few minutes, so please stand by. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are just going to let a few more people log on, and we'll just begin in about 1 minute. All right, we've got a great group here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, and welcome on our webinar on resetting the local economy after COVID-19. I'm Erica Manuel, the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government, and I'll be your moderator today. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll share the recording, the slide deck, and any related resources with all the registrants following the webinar. And all of your lines have been muted for the duration of this webinar, but you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties during this presentation or any questions of our panelists during their presentations, feel free to use that function. Next slide. So this webinar is designed, next slide. This webinar is designed to address some of the financial recovery issues that local government leaders are facing as they work to mitigate the negative fiscal impacts from the coronavirus pandemic. We know that local governments are projecting significant decreases in revenue as a result of this outbreak. From sales tax to TOT and other fees and recoveries, we have some new projections that suggest that the negative impacts will be pretty severe. So this webinar is designed to help you learn more about strategies that can help your local agency focus on economic resilience and recovery through creative assessment of land use, financing, and economic development tools. Next slide. This is the agenda for today's discussion. We want to give an overview of the technology and the logistics, and then we will dive into the content. I'll start with a short overview of CSAC and ILG for those of you who are not familiar with our organizations. And then we'll have presentations from our main panelists, Larry Cosmont and Ken Hira, before we jump into the Q&A. Larry and Ken should be visible on your screens, and I'll introduce them in just a few minutes. We structured this webinar to allow plenty of time for questions because we know this topic is really big, it's an important one, and we want to ensure that we get you as many answers as possible. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about how this webinar will work. Even though we've been sheltering in place for about 3 months, every technology solution is a little bit different, and it's always nice to clarify the technical details. So for today, as I mentioned, all participants will be on mute during the entire presentation. But if you do have questions during the webinar, once again, just type your questions into the question box at any time during the webinar. Please note that the question box is not the chat box. The ILG team will work throughout the webinar to review all the questions and determine the best time to ask them during the webinar. Logistics questions, we'll answer them as soon as possible, preferably through the chat or Q&A, but the programmatic and content questions should be posted in the Q&A section and in the Q&A box, and we will answer those typically at the end of the webinar. Next slide. So at this point in the webinar, we'd like to know who's on the line. We can't see you, but we definitely want to know who we're talking to. So please tell us a little bit about yourself. We have a few poll questions that will help our panelists better plan for your questions. My ILG colleague, Randy Kay, is actually behind the scenes now working on this technology for the session, so she'll be administering this poll. Randy Kay, can you please push the poll? The questions are, which best describes your agency or organization? Are you from a county, a city, a special district, a state agency or department, or are you with a private, corporate, nonprofit, or other type organization? Great. It looks like we've got a really interesting mix. We've got 8% counties, 68% city members, some special districts, some state agencies, and other private and corporate organizations. Thank you all. Randy Kay, do we have another question? All right. What best describes your relationship to local government? Are you staff? Are you an elected official? Are you a consultant or other? Looks like we've got a lot of staff on the line, which is fantastic. Over 60% staff, 10% elected officials, 10% consultants, and 14% other. Thank you so much. Those results are really helpful. And honestly, it will help our speakers sort of tailor their remarks so that we can focus on what we think you'll be most interested in. Next slide. Fantastic. So next, I'd like to ask our partner and webinar co-host from CSAC to say a few words about the CSAC Finance Corporation. CSAC is one of ILG's 3 affiliate organizations, and we're proud to co-host this webinar series with that team. We've done a few COVID series webinars with CSAC over the past few months. So Jim Manker, would you please share a little about CSAC and what your organization is doing to help counties navigate COVID?
Sure. Thank you, Erica. We do love our relationship with ILG and consider it a privilege to be a part of today. We also are excited about our relationship with Cosmont Companies. And one of the things that I'd personally like to say is that when you work with Cosmont, you start to learn that Ken and Larry are not just excellent advisors and know their business, but they're great people. And actually, you sit around across the table and you're like, I think these guys are becoming my friends too. So really appreciate Larry and Ken and Erica. CSAC, obviously, you know, we're all about counties in California. The CSAC Finance Corporation is in charge of all non-dues revenue that comes into CSAC. So obviously counties pay their dues and we lobby on behalf of them. And then there are a number of companies, Cosmont is one of them, that also make an investment in CSAC. And in return, we help them navigate the county waters in California. So we're proud to be here today. We're thankful for our relationships with Cosmont and ILG, and just looking forward to hearing from our experts today.
Thank you, Jim. All right, next slide. Before we dive into the presenter introduction, I do want to tell you a little bit about ILG. As I mentioned during the introduction, my name is Erica Manuel. I am the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. I've been at the helm of ILG for about 18 months, and I think just like most of you, we are navigating COVID, and we're in the midst of what is perhaps one of the most invasive and probably destructive crises to hit local government in 100 years. The good news for you is that ILG is nonprofit, we are nonpartisan, and we are here to help. As Jim mentioned, we are the nonprofit training and education affiliate, and we partner with 3 affiliate associations. CSAC is one of them, but we also are partners with the League of California Cities and the California Special Districts Association. Together with their 3 affiliates, we serve over 2,500 local agencies that include cities, counties, and special districts. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources so local agency leaders can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do love and understand local government, and that's why everything we do centers around helping local government leaders navigate the complexity of their roles. Next slide. So ILG has 4 main program areas or pillars of work: leadership and governance, civics, education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And our goal is to help these local government leaders navigate complexity, increase capacity, and build trust. We do that by offering a range of services across all of our pillars, like education and training, which is what this webinar counts as. But we also offer deep technical assistance and capacity building to stretch your ability to deliver on programs and services. We also convene key stakeholders and provide facilitation services around sticky and challenging topics where it's helpful to have a neutral party in the room that understands how local government works. Next slide. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we pivoted like you did to help ensure that local government leaders have the resources you needed to navigate the crisis. So feel free to check out our website to see state, national, and local links related to COVID response, and some tools and training opportunities, including recordings of all the webinars we've done on this topic, including those we partnered with CSAC on. Next slide. We also have a number in this presentation of resources and links that we will make sure you have access to, which include our affiliate organizations, CSAC, CSDA, and the League. Next slide. Our next free webinar is actually next Wednesday, July 15th. We have partnered with the Listos California campaign to help local leaders, especially local elected officials and their staff, understand the steps they can take to prepare our most vulnerable residents for natural disasters like wildfires, earthquakes, and more. It's, again, a free webinar, and we'll be hopefully giving a lot of really important and topical information around what we anticipate will be another, unfortunately, dangerous wildfire season. Next slide. And then these are a number of other free resources that we'll have in the packet that we email you all when this webinar is complete. Next slide. So for today's webinar and for all our COVID response efforts, we're really wanting to make sure that local government leaders have the exact information that you need to help you do your jobs on the ground. As I mentioned, we've done a number of COVID-themed webinars since the pandemic hit, and our intent with this particular topic is to continue the conversation about fiscal impacts and solutions for recovery. We know that whether you're a city, a county, or a special district, that this is a huge issue. This slide shows just a few of the statistics about fiscal impact to local jurisdictions. Every local agency is scrambling. They're trying to figure out how to navigate uncertainty and whether the inevitable recession or depression that comes is when it comes, we want you to be able to handle it. I think what we know based on the stats on this screen is that all jurisdictions, regardless of size and geography, are being impacted, and those with a high dependency on sales tax or transient occupancy tax are also very severely impacted as well. One of the things that we're seeing is that the League, CSAC, and CSDA, the legislative teams, are working very hard to secure additional state and federal funding for local agencies to help them weather the storm, but we don't really know when or how much will come. And so our speakers today are going to give some guidance tailored for those of you, like I said, that are on the ground. They're going to offer some short, medium, and long-term strategies to shape your thinking around economic recovery. We're going to hear about what land use and economic development tools are available and the mindset necessary to help you address those scenarios. We initially scheduled this webinar to take place in June, but we realize that there are a lot of factors that can impact an economy, and civil unrest certainly plays a role. And so we're also seeing, though, some changes to pandemic response around various counties as the infection levels change and rise and reopening procedures are shifting. So our presentation today is actually updated to reflect some of these new scenarios as much as possible, with the disclaimer that the landscape's evolving every single day. Next slide. So let's talk about our presenters. We are joined today by 2 experts who, as Jim mentioned, are fantastic guys. They're a lot of fun. They have decades of experience on the topics you're going to hear from today. We're going to hear from our speakers, and then we'll dive into Q&A, and we'll make sure to cover some of the issues that matter most to you. The plan certainly is to focus on economy, recovery, and resilience. So Larry Cosmont is our first speaker. He's the chairman and CEO of Cosmont Companies, which he founded in 1986. Cosmont Companies is an industry leader in public-private real estate transactions and economic development. The company, Cosmont Companies, includes Cosmont Realty, which is a real estate brokerage firm, and Cosmont Transaction Services, which sources financing for public agencies, P3s, and infrastructure. Larry also has significant experience in local government. He actually served as a city manager, an interim city manager, director of community development, and a redevelopment director in the cities of Santa Monica, Montebello, Seal Beach, Bell Gardens, and Burbank. He's also a licensed real estate broker in California and a designated counselor of real estate. He has lots of knowledge and is currently serving on a number of boards, including CalEd and LA Business Federation. Thank you for being here, Larry. Ken Hira is the president of Cosmont Companies. Ken is also an expert. He's focused on real estate and economic development. He brings over 30 years of experience in pretty much every aspect of acquisition, entitlement, development, financing, asset management, you name it. He has a really strong understanding of retail and land use trends, which will be great for this presentation. And he talks a lot about business retention and attraction, P3 transactions, and certainly implementing projects that revitalize communities and generate tax revenue. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to turn the controls over to you. And just as a reminder to the attendees today, if you do have questions for our panelists, please put those questions in the questions box, and we will do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible during the Q&A portion. Cosmont team, take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. My audio okay? Sounds good?
Yes.
Thank you. So first of all, as Jim said, it is a relationship business, and we are so pleased and honored, frankly, to be part of the ILG and CSAC team. They do an awesome job in bringing information, timely information to their constituent groups. And I would like to also say that in this presentation that you'll see today, Erica made the point, it's evolving. This is as swiftly changing a landscape as we have ever seen in terms of an economic context. That's why ILG and CSAC wanted to do this. Cosmont and the Cosmont team have been working for literally 4 months, since February, trying to figure out where the pattern tracks are in terms of economic displacement and recovery due to the pandemic. It's not simple. It is rather, fragmented and complex. But what we've done, and what you'll see, is a distilled presentation that tries to get to the heart of where we are now and how we can manage to a productive set of solutions, knowing that we're going to hit some bumps in the road. So resetting the economic development table. Next slide, please. So our company's been around since 1986. I am a former city manager. My one line that I would say is that our approach is to bring an integrated understanding of economic development and real estate and public finance to all our clients. Next slide. And you've seen these are Ken's much better looking, but I have to live with what I have here. Next slide. So we could be submerged by headlines today. There is no doubt. We can also be confused by them. But here's what we see at Cosmont and what we would like you to focus on. Yeah, we're all being crippled. Public agencies, cities, and counties. We've already seen Erica's slide on revenues, and we'll show you some of that. And we're trying to reopen, and that's going to be a hop, skip, and maybe a jump someday. Malls may be opening, but stores are shut. We have found as an economy a different way to deliver services and goods, and the pandemic has accelerated that differentiation and that movement to a doorstep and drive up economy. These are wholesale changes that have impacts on land use, on private investment, on public economic development. And that's the purpose of this presentation, is to identify and dissect what those shifts are, because the decisions you make today, next slide, are incredibly important. You need to be as accurate as you possibly can. We don't have a lot of resources, but whatever resources we have locally to engage private sector investment, to assist private sector recovery, and then get the benefits from those assistance programs in our tax base, those are the decisions that are key. So that's the COVID-19 challenge. It really knocks on the door of a concept that Ken and I have really come to recognize, and we want the industry to recognize this. We are in a land use revolution. Nothing is the same, and we'll show you that. Not only will we show you that, Ken will demonstrate or depict some dashboards for every real estate product type that we deal with: hotel, retail, industrial, single family residential, multifamily residential, and on. Those are all going through significant changes, and the land use revolution is here. It's what we do about it that makes sense, and that's where the new rules and the new tools come in. We'd like to show you how to really deal productively with these shifts as best as you can, and then I'll look to the future knowing that things will change. Next slide. So the resiliency and recovery from COVID is fleeting, it's changing. We started in the first chapter on the left, we started in the response mode. That's where government comes in. When we have tragedy, when we have economic dislocation, when we have a pandemic, it's all about public health, social need. There's an immediate response system that kicks in, and it consumes all of us. I mean, we have 60 plus public agency clients up and down the state in the Western United States. Hard to get a phone call back, right? If you're in the economic development business, you've all been in the preservation and relief business, which is where we tend to be now. We tend to be looking at relief, trying to get businesses assistance immediately, whether it's zoning assistance or permit assistance, and moving that forward to recovery, which is what this presentation really is about. Next slide. We know that we're experiencing tax decline. We know that we are looking at furloughs and layoffs. We know that we are consumed by day-to-day mayhem that we're trying to diminish as time goes on. What we don't quite know yet, but we have to start focusing on, and that's that green band, June, July, and moving forward. How do we get to recovery and resilience? Because once those waves start to become a little bit more predictable, the question is, how do we manage the future? And that's what, again, what we're talking about. It's how do we build that momentum? Next slide. So before I kick this off to Ken and set the table for what we have done a lot of work on, which is the economic development dashboards, which you'll see, I think you'll find them intriguing. It's a little bit about today, but it's mostly about tomorrow. Okay, today we have been in the kitchen figuring out how to manage cash flow, how to maximize revenue, how to minimize costs. We have responded quickly to flexible zoning issues like opening alleys and streets and public lands where restaurants and retailers can expand to the outdoors. Because guess what? In a pandemic, the outdoors is our new anchor, right? So we have to shift from indoors to outdoors. We have been convening with business groups, with the state, and we're going after state federal funds. That's right. We have to preserve. We have to be able to be resilient for the moment. So you preserve cash and you keep projects in operation going. But tomorrow, that's where the fork in the road is. How do you leverage the assets you have to induce private sector investment? That's challenging in and of itself. Think about this. There's nothing about private investment that is the same as it was in January. We're a consumer-based economy that got shut down and are trying to restart, and yet the very things we rely on, the ability to go to a store, the ability to get on a plane, the ability to go on vacation and spend money is all challenged. So for us locally, we have to figure out, how do we respond, not just on the day-to-day, but for tomorrow? Do we reorganize our capital investments? Do we reorganize and reprioritize our infrastructure? And how? And how? If a mall is shutting down, what can we do? What can we do to take that to a different conclusion, to a productive and improved conclusion? So there are a couple of programs we'll talk about. Part of tomorrow is looking at opportunity. One opportunity that's been handed to us that is unique is an incredibly low interest rate environment. One of the things that we've been doing here at Cosmon is working with a number of our clients to reduce their debt load. When tax exempt and taxables are under 3% in terms of bond financing, you can refinance existing obligations and use some of that to create liquidity and make that reinvestment. Again, back to number 1 and 2, you've got to figure out where to make that investment. But the truth is that you can go ahead and generate cash flow. For example, in Carson, just 2 weeks ago, we refinanced out of pension obligation debt to CalPERS at a less than 3.5% carry rate when Carson was paying PERS 7% as the investment target rate. That resulted in a $40 million savings over the 25-year refunding. Those are real dollars that can be done, and they are handed to us because we're in a low interest rate environment. And as we move forward to tomorrow, here's the converging challenge we all have. We are, without a doubt, you'll see it when Ken goes through the dashboards, we are without a doubt in a land use revolution. Changing consumer activity has impacted every product type. And worse yet, and even more important, is that it's changed how the private sector is responding to consumer needs. And they're making immediate changes that are accelerated by the drastic environment from COVID. So if we're going to invest in a sustained recovery, we're going to be resilient. What do we need to know? We need to know where these product types are, what they are doing, how they're performing financially, and how we can manage our economic development priorities and investments so we can bet on the right horse, so we can take our economy locally and regionally and make it work in the future. Chasing retail today is chasing your tail. If you're a dog, you will go nowhere. We know that. It's a hard pill to swallow, though. We've spent 35 years in California, post-Prop 13, chasing retail. And retail is imploding. It's not gone. It's just not the target at this point that we need to focus on. So Ken will talk you through these product types. I'm going to hand it over to him. Then I'm going to come back and talk about the tools and the opportunities to use those tools for each one of those product types. Ken?
Yeah, thank you very much, Larry. And I do want to thank ILG and CSAC, of course. I think Erica and Jim are in fact friends. So we really appreciate that. And it's really an honor to be presenting to so many folks who have signed up for this webinar. Larry and I have both been watching and giving lots of webinars, as you can imagine, over the last several months. And it's been quite, frankly, productive. We're learning something new every day. But we both, Larry and I, who co-authored this, both decided that we needed the Beatles at least to be part of this somewhere. So the question is, you say you want a revolution. Well, you got it. Next slide. Larry obviously made emphasis on the fact that every product type is going through a change. I was presenting yesterday on a different webinar to a group of Silicon Valley economic development folks, and it was focused on retail. And it's really easy to talk about how retail has changed over the years, because retail basically is constantly changing. I think it's probably hit a phase in its evolution where it's perhaps changing the most as a function of COVID. But pre-COVID, we were talking a lot about a retail revolution, frankly. But it's hard to talk about retail without talking about all product types, because the impact of hotels and retail and office and residential and industrial in this change that's going on, this rapid change that's going on, is how all of the cities and frankly the private sector folks and counties have to really be thinking about land use. I think it's going to impact general plans. I think it's going to impact specific plans, economic development strategies, and different land use assessments that you all are probably in the middle of trying to figure out, including, and not to mention, your budgeting on a go-forward basis. Hotel and retail have been two asset classes or land uses that clearly cities and counties have relied upon for major revenue streams. And we're going to get into a discussion about revenue streams in a second. But from a land use revolution perspective, from a hotel asset class or land use perspective, you're going to want to keep a close eye on business versus leisure and how the hotel industry comes back. I'll get into a series of slides that are our indexes or indices that'll help you on a go-forward basis and our dashboards. But here's the high level. Retail. Retail clearly is going through a major change. Online and malls. Malls really end up being, in a sense, if you want to look at the glass half full, a major opportunity for repositioning and reimagination. And so we'll talk more about that. Office. Is there going to be demand for more office? Well, if you work from home, no. If you create a 6-foot spacing requirement within every office, yes, there'll be greater demand. So there's a reconfiguration that the office market is going to experience. Residential has remained strong. We are clearly in a growing need and a lack of supply in our state, frankly, and across the country for residential. And we'll talk a little bit about multifamily versus single family and how the urbanization or the suburbanization, if you will, is having its impact today based on COVID. And industrial. Industrial is sort of the leader of the pack in our minds with logistics and fulfillment and last mile delivery and some onshore manufacturing. Next slide, please. The pace of resiliency and recovery. On the vertical axis, what you'll see is our categorization of assets and which ones are more or less resilient. So the more resilient ones are at the top. Industrial has clearly been very resilient. Multifamily and single family has been very resilient in this process. Office, a little less resilient, if you will. It's going through some changes as we're working from home. If you look at retail, again, a scattering based on this sort of animation that says that some retail has been quite resilient, which is the grocery side or the essential side of the business. And others, again, the malls, which is a pre-existing condition, have really been challenged with these big boxes that have been shrinking and the department stores that are basically evaporating from the landscape. And then the hotel industry probably hit the hardest out of all the asset classes. But what you're finding based on our estimation of recovery is you'll see that on the horizontal axis, the recovery time. How long is it going to take for these asset classes to come back? And you'll see that picture here. Obviously, you'll be able to see these slides in more detail as you review them because you'll have access to them. So we'll go through them maybe a little bit quickly, but this is a very important chart to take a look at with respect to both resiliency and recovery. Next slide, please. How does the public markets or the stock market view asset classes? Well, this is a graph. In blue was everything that was cooking in 2019. And you can see there was a high level of return on investment for publicly traded real estate stocks in these categories of land uses across the board. In the red, you're finding what's happening in 2020, mainly as a function of COVID. And you can see hotel has been hit hard at a 46% loss. Retail has been hit hard at a 44% loss. And then if you quickly look to industrial, basically there's been a flat return on industrial. And you might know the saying, flat is the new up. That's what industrial is experiencing right now. And you can see it's one of the only ones that really isn't in a very strong negative return state as a function of how the stock market views different asset classes. Next slide, please. Private sector loss is sort of public sector loss. And what we've been looking at for every one of our communities that we do work for is first starting with what does the picture of California cities look like from a tax revenue perspective? The pie chart is very telling. General fund revenues comprise about 41% from property tax, 22% from sales tax, and about 8% from TOT. You can look at your city, which I'll show you in a second, and you can understand where you fall within that pie chart. Most of the client work that we do, we take that pie chart and we do it for the city that we're working for. Because we'd like to know, are you overweight or underweight when it comes to a reliance on sales tax, a reliance on TOT, transient occupancy tax, or are you relying on property tax, which seems to be in a more stable state today? As you can imagine, hotel and sales are more volatile. Next slide, please. So this is a scattergram, if you will, of all cities in California. And you'll find the heavy reliance on TOT versus the heavy reliance on sales, or even a combination of both, is depicted on this chart. And the more heavily reliant you are clearly on hotel, and you saw the returns, is going to be more challenging for your general fund revenues. And then how do you predict and project the comeback, as well as sales tax revenue? Next slide, please. And what we did specifically was we took the top 20 cities that are reliant on sales tax, which is on the left or in the green, and the top 20 cities which is reliant on TOT, which is in blue on the right. And we wanted to ascribe also what county these were in. So for the folks on the call where we're looking at counties and cities and how everybody is experiencing a sales tax or a hotel tax risk or reliance or a challenge, this is the list. And it's pretty interesting to us that places like Sand City and Signal Hill and Shafter and many cities have such a high reliance, if you will, on sales tax. Frankly, if you look at the line on the left, there's 15 cities that have a 50% or more reliance on sales tax for their general funds. That's something to keep a very close eye on as you plan for the future. On TOT, it's similar. To have a 70% reliance on TOT, which is Mammoth Lakes, they've got to look really closely and focus on how are we going to get our hotels back in business. That's their priority for many of these cities that have high TOT reliance. Next slide, please. And counties for that matter. Okay, here's our first dashboard, hospitality. The short answer here is we're seeing basically a 3-year rebound. We have discussions directly with the hotel chains. We're hearing that 2023 might be a year where new hotels could get built. In the meantime, what's the impact? Virtual impact, the consumer confidence ratios, the consumer comfort levels, the global economy for international tourism. All things are going to be they're high variables to come back, and the impact on the hospitality industry. Will we not stay in a hotel for the rest of our lives? That's not accurate. But taking a look at leisure versus business travel is going to be very important. With Zoom and the different virtual meetings, we're going to look differently at business travel. So leisure travel may come back a little quicker, but again, on a consumer confidence or comfort level. And so how do you strategically consider some of these economic development variables for the hotel industry? And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about. Next slide, please. The Hospitality Recovery Index. In the short term, it's going to be about cleanliness. Sort of in the midterm, there may be some considerations even for hotel conversions, if you will. There may be a hospitality office, hospitality co-working, even a hospitality residential blend of uses in the midterm. And then long term, there can be some of the economic development tools that we've identified here, Development Opportunity Reserve, or even a sales tax assessment revenue, or a transient occupancy tax assessment revenue tool, in order for cities and counties to take a look at, well, what's the impact on their general funds of how some of these land uses can frankly be reutilized and revitalized. Next slide. Retail. You can see the decline in the red for about 6 quarters consecutively, past and future, as a projection for net absorption, and this happens to be in Los Angeles, for retail. So huge impact from e-commerce, huge impact from the food, grocery, and doorstep economy that Larry referred to before. So what's going to be the key for retail? You know, there's probably a 2-year comeback for retail in some way, shape, or form. But at the end of the day, there's going to need to be a major reimagination. If hotels are resetting, retail has to be reimagined. And again, one of those opportunities is going to be in the mall or large retail homogeneous districts, if you will. I use that term because we've found in our studies and our evaluation of different communities that the large retail environments or districts or downtowns really need to be focused on in terms of a retooling. And again, it's a blending of uses, which is an integration of uses, and it's taking advantage of the outdoor space. Next slide. Our index is clearly going to be in the short term about flexibility. It's a term I've been using a lot. And I think both public and private sectors need to exercise flexibility, but specifically cities can help themselves with being more flexible when it comes to zoning and codes. If a restaurant wants to put their barbecue in a parking lot, it's probably the wrong time to look at your code as a community and say you can't do that. These folks are trying to be innovative and they're trying to figure out creative ways to recover. So you're seeing all these common areas and parking lots turn into basically the inside of these restaurants, inside of these retail stores. It's about the curbside, the pickup, the delivery, the dreaded drive-through, if I can say that, you know, which has been sort of not a walkable product type, but has been essential in the recovery and survival of some of the retail businesses. So in the short term, there'll be some very important sort of immediate changes and flexibility that will be important, and open-mindedness, if you will, that'll need to come. And then in the same token, the private sector needs to be, another term I've used a lot is collaborative. There needs to be more collaboration between the public and private sectors, maybe now like no other time in the past. It's sort of the public-private partnership that we've talked a lot about, of course, in the past. So in the midterm, industrial and retail will even blend together. There will be fulfillment, and there will be different means by which we get our products, doorsteps, online, pickup, etc. And in the long term, we really think the strategy is to think about the blending of uses. These major retail locations are going to be perfect candidates because they're well located, they're within communities, to be sort of community-driven, integrated villages or town centers. And that includes multiple product types. It's not going to be one giant mall anymore. Every mall in our country, for that matter, has got space too large. And every mall in our country, whether they completely reopen or not, is going to need to be reimagined. Outdoor amenities, we're finding are going to be critical. Same with the restaurant industry that I made reference to. And outdoor space and outdoor amenities and open space, we see them as the new anchor tenant. Next slide, please. Office, huge reconfiguration. The prediction from CoStar on the LA office market looks like there's a bit of a blip. Maybe it's a couple years. It'll be about how much we work from home, how much we share our working environment, meaning that are we in the office or at home or a combination thereof. I believe that's going to be the case. Are we in a 6-foot office configuration that's going to basically require more office needs? These are some of the questions we're asking ourselves. But one thing I do believe is that I will not be sitting in my living room working for the rest of my life. I think we're going to be out in the environment, wanting to get in front of people to meet again. And I think that's going to just be human nature in the same token that we're not shopping from our homes for the rest of our lives. So there will be sort of a reconfiguration in the office market. And really strategic considerations is going to be about, is there a residential component that can be incorporated into office? Is there daytime population and co-working environments that I think are considerations? Next slide, please. The recovery. Again, short term is going to be a function of the working from home landscape. Long term, it's going to be about collaboration and coordination, and as well as maybe some potential of conversions. Could offices be converted into different product types? Well, can they be incorporated as well into some of these mall environments that we've talked about? Because the mall environments are looking for more live, work, and play, which is a term we've used often in the past. Next slide, please. Residential has been very strong, been very resilient. On that vertical line that I showed you earlier, multifamily is in a pretty strong position. The question is going to be about density. Are we really looking for less density as a function of social distancing? Are we looking for less density as a function of being in a more suburban environment? So we use this term surban, which is sort of in between. It's going to be something to take into consideration. One thing we do know is that multifamily is being incorporated to many of these retail centers. And so you'll see we put on here multifamily is the refill for shrinking retail. Next slide. Single family. Again, in high demand, you can see that our chart shows in LA that there's just been a continual increase in the values of homes. We don't see that changing, frankly. The question is going to be, is there's going to be more demand for non sort of infill environments? There's going to be more demand for suburban environments. Is a central part of our state going to benefit from this potential desire to find less density? Those are some of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves on residential. Next slide, please. So on the recovery, again, there'll be a design component to residential. Will we be working from home? Will there be more flexibility within our 4 walls of our homes? We believe yes. Will there be more need for green space and open space? Yes, that will be part of the new residential renaissance, which is what we're calling it. Next slide, please. Industrial, sort of the winner out of all of this. It's really hit a short-term blip in terms of its demand. E-commerce, if our country has more retail per capita than any other country by a long shot in the world, will that footprint for retail effectively become an industrial footprint? Will retail space within centers get converted, if you will, to sort of an e-commerce or fulfillment need? Will there be more demand for cold storage? Yes. Will the grocery and restaurant delivery business put demand on cold storage? Yes. Is there last mile delivery demand? Is there the need for more infill and urbanized industrial? Yes. And like Larry and I talked about before, a phrase that he used recently is industrial. This is not your father's industrial. The thinking about what industrial used to be was places relegated within communities that were sort of not within where the people spent time. And the adjacencies to other uses like residential were challenging. Industrial's evolving into not just manufacturing, but it's e-commerce, it's fulfillment, it's delivery, and it wants to be closer and closer to our doorsteps, frankly. So that's going to be a major revolution component of the industrial space, which is in very high demand, as you can tell. Next slide, please. And our recovery index says, start thinking about industrial as a value capture opportunity. We've got economic development tools like sales tax assessment revenue, where re-entitlement of properties that were commercial might want to be industrial now, but for a fulfillment center. So how do cities and counties capture the value that comes from that industrial demand? There are tools, and we've used those tools in order to do that. That inures to the benefit of both public and private parties. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, at least for this section. But really the question for this slide is, how are we going to get out of this crisis? And if it's one word, you might use the word innovation. So if you look at this slide, which is just a fun sort of pictorial of a lot of retail, but a lot of sort of revolution and evolution that's coming out of this pandemic, is you have a lot of entrepreneurs, small businesses thinking outside the box. I've done a retail trends presentation for 7 or 8 years in collaboration, with my colleagues at Cosmon, obviously, and we've brought to the marketplace a retail trends presentation that has highlighted what's happening in the world. Like no time other, innovation and entrepreneurship is really what retail is all about. This is the year to think out of the box. And that's been the theme pre-COVID and particularly post-COVID. So I'll leave it there, Larry. If you want to take on the next part of this in terms of new tools and rules, that'd be great.
Will do. Thanks, Ken. So moving forward, starting with innovation, the flip side of recovery from a revolution is about how to take yourself to the next step as a local economy. So if I can move the next slide, great. So we're going to talk about shifting innovatively on the public sector side to capture the changes and the dynamics that are happening on the private sector side. 2 key rules. 1, things are different. Number 2, they're going to be different some more as we go forward. So how you make these decisions and the tools that you use are really strategic imperatives. I'm going to suggest to all of you that are looking to the future to first get to understand what you have today. What Ken and I and Cosmon have been doing have been economic assessments of the current economic base for a community, trying to match those and overlay those with private sector investment initiatives that we see going on. And that's that retail trends presentation Ken's been talking about. And then taking those 2 pieces of information and overlaying the toolkit, because that's how you move out of this. And that's how you make this a success. So whether it's a city that has a large retail mall that is 2 or 3 empty anchors or anchors about to leave, and has now had the middle part of the mall eviscerated because of the pandemic, that retail makeover on the left becomes a key strategic imperative. Value capture. This is not your father's industrial, and we don't give away zoning anymore. And these next 2 tools, Development Opportunity Reserve and Sales Tax Assessment, are all about the notion that zoning is currency. Entitlements are currency. Private investment requires those currencies to rejuvenate. So how we use our currency with theirs becomes really critical. We'll show you some case studies of what we mean. They're very real tools. They just haven't been used enough, because when we were in a redevelopment world, when we were in a sales tax plenty world, it wasn't as imperative to be so strategic, to be so refined about how to get value capture going. Different today. Special districts, the big picture is you have to pick, as we said, step one, take an assessment of your community. You have to pick the part of your community that you can overlay a special tax district on, whether it's an EIFD or a CREA or just a project-specific CFD. Funding, bringing low-cost public funding in a very unique and low interest rate environment to a transaction like retail makeover, like the redo of a major mall, is absolutely a key tool. Important to say that all of these tools you see, they coexist. They're not just one answer. They're not silos. They transition back and forth. It's a playbook. You take your playbook out as you need it. You combine plays. Finally, asset sales and public financing. Really underutilized, I think, by the public sector. We have assets we own that we can lease or we can sell. Here's the interesting thing about the pandemic. The capital market may be a little frozen right now. Why are they frozen? Because they don't have money? No. There's a ton of what we call dry powder out there on the sidelines. Here's what they don't have: clarity as to where to put that money, right? That's what we're waiting for. We have a different kind of circumstance in the public sector. We have assets that we can put into a transaction that can serve as breadcrumbs for that money, for the decision of investment. We also have on the debt side the ability to take a 2% or 3% interest rate and cash in and create cash and liquidity to help us effectuate these other programs we're talking about. So next slide. What I would like to do is show you some case studies that take these tools and put them into work. Here's the most important point. We've said this to you a couple of times. In this spectrum of recovery, in this, if you will, in this matrix of what goes first, there are no clear answers. Every one of these communities are different, but we know that investments in industrial, if we follow the private investment sector, pretty much a winner. We know that retail, we know that residential is coming back fairly quickly. We know that office has a very good chance of expansion, and the question is, how do we help the right office projects? And we understand that restaurants and retail will be a staggered comeback. How can we be strategic about that? How can we use these tools to make the recovery time as preferential, as advantageous as possible? That's the point. We need to make the right bets. So let's talk about some of the bets that are out there, if you will. Next slide. Okay, here is the opportunity of a lifetime. I think we have a once in a generation opportunity to take 50 years of capital investments in large regional malls that have become a way of life for the entire country. There's not a movie, there's not a play. Almost it doesn't make a reference to going to the mall, to taking your family to the mall, to go buy and consume. These are the centerpieces of most communities that have significant or moderate even density. Here's the Laguna Hills Mall, something that Ken and Cosmo have been working on for a number of years. Closed in 2018, 60 acres. The 3 acres, Sears, JCPenney's, and Macy's. I mean, it's like a bad football draft. You just, no one would have known that 30 years ago, but these are not your first round picks anymore. They're just not. Retail isn't your first round pick. But here's what got eviscerated in the pandemic: the middle box and closed retail. I mean, you have what, just in the last 2-3 months, GNC, Brook Brothers, Aldo, Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J. Crew, True Religion, Pier 1, Tuesday Morning, spelled MOURNING, morning. We have retail that is shifting, and it's shifting out of the landscape, but there will be retail. There will be retail that adapts. There's retail that's related to the internet. There's retail that's related to a necessity of a trip. And those are the shifts that we have to deal with in terms of this land use revolution. So the tool here and the opportunity here is to take this large piece of property that exists in hundreds of California communities and revitalize it with a blended use, next slide, approach, using the tools that we're talking about. The reason we lead with this is because in a pandemic, you need to find your largest, your deepest, your most expansive solutions. This is not a short-term play, but if you don't restructure your regional mall to add residential, to create outdoor attractions, to bring creative office that uses the outdoors, to bring shops that require trips, whether they're medical or educational, to put in those specialized drive-throughs and anchors and create that blended use village with all different kinds of density. If you don't do that, you will have a major asset crawl into oblivion for 10 or 20 years, and it will be hard to recapture that revenue momentum without making this investment. So think about retail reimagination into blended use as a major platform for reinvestment in this economy. Here's the beauty of this one. The private sector has figured this out. Ken showed you the valuation of retail in the marketplace. If you want to go do some research on REITs, you'll see they're all positioning these retail malls, these retail REITs are all positioning or repositioning to include residential and other uses. We have willing partners as cities with large REITs that own these properties to make this reinvestment. What we have, next slide, are things to induce those investments. So let's talk about that. Development Opportunity Reserve. So this is the Buellton case study. It was a corridor. It's essentially a primary retail and economic corridor for the city of Buellton. Here's an example of establishing new density and using that density as currency to incite and invite new private sector investment. And here's how it works. Rather than creating that specific plan that gives away zoning at the front end, so all of you on this phone, let me just urge you to rethink your specific plan in this pandemic environment and going forward forever. We have spent the last 30 years in California approving specific plans that increase the density and give it to the existing property owners, most of which have no concept and no motivation to redevelop that property. We've just conferred a gift of zoning. Development Opportunity counteracts that. It just says, look, I'll approve the specific plan. I'll increase the zoning, let's say over a 60-acre retail center like Laguna Hills. I'll give you 3-to-1 density instead of 1-to-1 density. But I'm not going to assign it to that property. I'm going to put it in a bucket called Development Opportunity Reserve. And when we get the right project, we will trade that pre-approved density off for that project. We will insert additional density as currency to your deal. We'll provide you essentially new equity in the form of density. And if that's residential density, you can see on the residential matrix or dashboard, that has great value. Those are hot products. There's huge demand. In Buellton, the benefits that you pre-establish in the DOR are the enticement to your community to do it, because your community can weigh in and say, I tell you what we need: public restrooms, offsite improvements, public parking, public art, parks, green buildings. You set those up as the basis for the trade-off of additional density that you give away, that you pre-approve, but you only give away when you have that development agreement application in front of you for a project that gets done what you want. Next slide. I'll show you another value capture tool. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Jurupa Valley. This is the not your father's industrial solution here. So here, there is a move in suburban economies to move where you have land to put in industrial. The problem is that we've all chased the ghost of retail, because it is now the ghost of retail. No, make no doubt about it. So the loss of retail sales, though, from leaving the dream of putting a regional center or a retail center in the space that wants to be industrial, is a hard pill to swallow, especially now when we're losing all our sales tax. But praying for more sales tax from retail is not the answer. That's just a wish. We can do value capture. We can use the entitlements as currency. We can enter into a development agreement that basically has an annual payment for a prescribed period of time that basically compensates for that loss of expected sales tax as part of the transaction for vested development rights. So we exchange a development agreement approval and the entitlements related to that with a sales tax payment or a TOT payment. We basically can barter and use entitlements as currency. It is, if you think about development and opportunity reserve, where you create density and gives you value, or you replace the loss of value because you're going to give away zoning that doesn't have sales tax, you start to recapture that. Those are the kinds of tools that we're talking about. Next slide. And you can mix and match, because if you have a 60-acre shopping center, you can use a STAR payment for the residential. You can use development opportunity reserve for all of the density. These are prescribed tools that can be strategically and surgically used. Here's a bigger tool, right? Here's a bigger one. This one says, I'm going to paint the whole house. This is value capture with special districts. In value capture with special district, what you're doing is you're identifying the opportunities in your community that are broader. In the case of enhanced infrastructure financing districts, the beauty is, this is a new statute created in 2014. We're working on about 30 of these statewide. Cosmont has been a leader in these, I would say probably the leader. We've now created 3 active EIFDs and moving forward on more. These are districts that capture the increment in property tax. And in places like Placentia, we decided that, since a longtime client, that there were certain areas of the city that needed investment and that were likely and well positioned to get investment, and in which we were making infrastructure improvements. The beauty of that is we take the captured dollar of future development and we reinvest it in all of the infrastructure that supports that initial front-end investment. Now, I'll tell you the importance of this now in today's market. The EIFD provides an economic baseline for private investors to go to the capital market, which is nervous, and say, look, rather than shift the equity debt relationship on this large property, if you're going to tell me that pre-COVID on a $100 million project, I could get a $70 million loan, and now I can only get a $50 million loan. That is a huge displacement for the private sector. But if the private sector can show up in a public-private partnership with you, like they can in Placentia, and say, you know what? All of the value that we create when you give us a construction loan for 65 or 70 million gets thrown into this district, and the district is going to reinvest the value that we bring to the community back to our project or adjacent to our project. That lets the lender understand that there is some public equity, if you will, that underwrites and helps them underwrite those investments. That's the beauty of this particular district. And the way California has positioned these is that you can pick multiple districts in your city. They don't have to be contiguous, but they can all be part of one EIFD. So if you have transit here, you have a regional mall here, you have a downtown there, you can put those 3 areas in a district, in that single district, and go shopping for private capital. This is an invitation, if you do it right, to invite private capital investment in the areas that need it most, like that dying regional mall. Next slide. Finally, achieving liquidity with financing tools. You need money to make money. I mean, it's an old adage. We understand that. And we're cash strapped today. You saw the chart, private sector pain and public sector pain. They're matched. There's a gift. It's one of the few gifts from Washington that we'll ever see, I think, but it is a gift, and it says it's a low interest rate, where in the Carson case, where they had $108 million of pension obligation unfunded accrued liability debt just a month ago, we were able to refinance that debt, which was a 7% pay rate, to less than 3.5%, generating a $40 million budget relief result. This is just a gift to be able to use this low interest rate environment responsibly. You have to do it the right way. No one wants to recommend debt unnecessarily. We want to recommend efficient and strategic debt, and this marketplace is handing it to us. It's timely. It's an advantage that we can work to our own credit. Next slide. So just so you know, these are not artificial tools. These are real tools and real deals that we have placed and done time and time again over the last years. I think many of you know us. We're very transactional at Cosmont. One of the advantages we have is we do understand private sector investment and return, along with public sector expectations for tax and job generation, and also appetite for risk. These are not risk averse, but they're also not entirely risky. They are strategic, they are timely tools, and they're being done in all these communities. Next slide. So we always have government-sponsored recovery, and we urge you, just as an overall strategy, we have talked to you so far about the state of where things are, the dashboards of all these products, what may come back first, what may not come back at all. We've talked to you about how to engage value capture, how to use public finance, low interest rates, how to use zoning as currency, entitlements as currency. We also want to encourage you to continue to use what we call OPM, other public money. Other public money is important. Today, Cosmont is focused on a number of economic development grants through the EDA that are COVID-based. They're immediate resuscitation dollars that we need to go after in conjunction with those other tools we talked about. These tools may be temporary, but even more important to take advantage of them. And we may see a public infrastructure funding bill out of the COVID circumstance from the feds. That could be the next chapter. We'll see. Next slide. So life after COVID. Not sure when that is, by the way. Not sure if that ever occurs, totally, by the way. And that's the whole point of this. We have to act with a set of solutions that can move and be flexible and can be strategic and can be productive. And the private sector is the first to do it. I love Las Brisas and Laguna, not just because I like margaritas, but because they turned this indoor restaurant into an outdoor haven. They used a parking lot. I mean, I almost never made it to the beach. I just wanted to hang out here. These are examples of how creative the private sector can be. You need to figure that out and make investments with them. Next slide. Here's the question. When do consumers come back? I mean, at the end of the day, none of the deals we work on, those 5 tools we talked about, those 5 dashboards we showed you, merging those into a successful public-private partnership or transaction for that matter, doesn't happen immediately. It takes a while. And what we have to keep our eye on is, when do consumers become comfortable that they can return? I mean, if you look at this is, I think, as of April, there's an update for May that we'll soon have. But 70%, if you look at the black bar down the middle, 70% of folks to the right don't have any thought about traveling, going to a concert, amusement park, or museum in the next 6 months. They're just not ready. There's a lot more openness to going out to eat. There's some openness to going out to a mall. Gyms are mixed, vacation mixed. This is the pandemic trail that we have to understand. I mean, how do we get that consumer back? I started just by saying this is very much a consumer economy. But when, at this point, when 17% are willing to go to an amusement park, 15% willing to go to a concert, 10% willing to travel abroad, wow. I mean, now you shift, going out to eat, 35%, going on vacation, 33%, going to a shopping mall, 31%. These are trends that say, okay, maybe we work on restaurants, on regional malls first, and maybe we work on local destination hotels and business hotels, because guess what? Those are quicker on the food chain in terms of coming back. All our point is on this slide is, Erica said it well in the beginning when she was introducing us, all the data here changes. This data will be different. This line can move next month. We saw by the way, we saw increases for restaurant and malls dramatically in May. In June, by the end of June, we started to see drops because of the return. So the patterns and the consistency of this are really key. Next slide. So Ken, back to you.
Yeah, we want to wrap up because we want to get to questions, but here's some of the key takeaways from our perspective. And as Larry mentioned, we're a very transaction-oriented firm. We are actually working on a lot of projects, a lot of public-private negotiations. And so, yes, there are some deals that we call stuck. So the key is to try to figure out in your community, your city, your county, how do you unstick a stuck deal? And it gets back to some of the discussions we've had, being open-minded, being creative, being innovative, being flexible, and being collaborative. Those are some of the key things we've got to start really thinking for the future and looking at deals that are in a place where they can move forward, and it's probably a good time to actually advance those deals in terms of entitlements and negotiations. It's the wrong time to stop. It's the wrong time to let a deal or a project be stuck. Next slide. So focus the plan on the project. There are also ways right now, we've made reference to some of the fact that capital is actually, private sector dollars are actually very opportunistic right now. So if cities and communities can kind of really think about how do I invite those dollars into my community? How do I invite those dollars to make an investment into my community? If you have projects that you can keep focused on and keep your planning and strategic approach to be focused on those projects, you can keep the process going. If you want a project to come out of the ground in 2 years, the worst thing you can do now, and what we're finding, is to stop the planning process, is to stop the strategic or economic development process associated with that project. Because if you do stop now, it won't come out of the ground in 2 years. It'll come out of the ground in 5 years. And we want to be thinking about the future. Next slide, please. Larry, go ahead.
So pursue the right opportunities. We've said this a lot, but I will say this to you. There's not a day that goes by that Ken and I are not getting calls from capital funds and private investors, and they're asking us which communities are ready to make some shifts, because investors love California. They just don't like the zoning environment, candidly. They don't like the CEQA environment. There's not much we can do about CEQA, but the flexibility of communities, to Ken's point, that are willing to move on deals now, be flexible in their zoning, and push projects that are accretive to their community, not a giveaway, that are accretive. It's the opposite from a giveaway. We're telling you to go ahead and barter your zoning, barter your entitlements. Don't give it away like we used to in the specific plan. No. But they're asking, who can we work with? So the point is for us, as we serve you, is let's get yourself investor ready. Let's pick those projects and move forward. Next slide. So our key strategy that we see, the 4R strategy, is about recovering resilience by reimagining retail. When you are, as Ken mentioned, what are we, like 2,000 square feet per 100 people in the United States? I mean, the most countries are under 400, right? So we're 5 times, 6 times over retail than the rest of the world. No exaggeration. That's data. We have a once in a generation opportunity to go shift that retail and make it something else. And so resetting retail, looking at the new industrial, looking at the new residential, and figuring out how to put that together, that's a stunning opportunity that we have. And it's one that the private sector investment pool is ready to take on. What they don't know is, are you ready, right? And that's the message that we have to get out there. Next slide. So just in wrapping up, I think, Ken, the most important thing is community assessment and flexible land use. We talked about that.
Yeah, it's really taking an inventory for every city and community. What do you have in light of all this discussion we've had, all the data, all the sort of strategic opportunities? What do you have? I think the first step is, what's the assessment of that? What does that look like? And then you have to juxtapose that with current zoning and current planning standards, and then figure out, are those things congruent or incongruent? More than likely today, there's an incongruency between what exists and what the zoning or planning codes say.
Right, and what we have found is that we've gone to communities, we've had workshops with communities where we say, look, here's what you have, here's what the private sector is interested in. Are you willing to trade off zoning and density and enter into entitlement transactions that can capture that investment and capture value for you? And the way you have that conversation with your community, with your city council and your constituents, is to show them the value that can emanate from that you're not giving away zoning, you're actually capturing amenities for the community that they can pre-decide. The other question that we have in these workshops is, how can we better manage our cash flow? Now, we understand the finance directors, they're out there really trying to plug the holes. But there's a different philosophy. Can we take that book of debt and refinance it so that we have some liquidity on the short end for whatever the priorities are when we do our community assessment? Cosmont has no predisposed notion about what that is. We just know that you ought to have that conversation. You ought to have that evaluation. Identify revenue and funding opportunities. Let's go after the money. Let's go after private sector sources. If you know the first three, you can work on the fourth and the fifth, which is economic development opportunities and projects, selecting the right project. I'm just going to move to the next slide. I know we're out of time. And so just in summary, we've given you a lot of data. We've given you a number of things to think about. And it's very deliberate because we're just fortunate. Ken and I have a team of 20 people at Cosmont that do nothing but figure out how to structure and finance and position economic development transactions for all of you, for local communities. Here's our toolkit, whether it's other people's money, OPM, or other public money, whether it's flexible land use and zoning, or it's taking that big piece of property that's going downhill or going sideways because it's a dysfunctional retail center, and then using ways to capture and reuse those centers through currency tools like DOR and STAR, whether it's using opportunity zones or special districts or those land assets that you own that you're willing to ground lease or you're willing to sell. And finally, looking at your debt closet and saying, should I sort of tailor some of that debt to give me the ability to work the rest of these tools? That's the environment we're in. It's a post-COVID world. You know, do we think that that is something to be pessimistic about? Absolutely not. I think if you ask Ken and I, we have some good chapters facing us. They're just different. It's harder in life when you haven't seen the script before, but it doesn't mean the script won't be a good one. And we think if you do it the right way, you take on these challenges with a sense of optimism and a good level of strategy, you can be very successful. We look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Awesome, gentlemen. Thank you so much. We have reached the Q&A portion of our webinar, and for those of you that have been listening in this whole time, we have been collecting your questions throughout the presentation, and we've got a pretty long list of them. What I will say is that those of you who have a question that doesn't get answered today, we will make sure that our panelists continue to get to see these, and that hopefully they can follow up with you via email. We've been capturing those contact information and addresses as well. So we'll dive right in. So Larry and Ken, your recovery checklist and your toolkit slides, I think, gave a pretty good overview of how local agencies can get started. But we started talking a lot about TOT, and for those cities that are reliant on TOT, that are reliant on it for, let's say, more than 40% of their revenue, what are some things they can do to survive during this current fiscal year? Any guidance you can give the panelists?
I want to keep these answers short because we have a lot of questions, but so this is a key question for everyone. Part one is you need to understand your specific hotel market. So that means you need to have an in-depth conversation with your hotel operators and owners to see what their constituency is. Is it local? Has it been business? Are there collateral services that those audiences would like? Can you help them on their cleanliness theater? Can you support them on improvements that introduce the notion of safety and cleanliness quickly? But the most important thing is, if you want to get an increased visits, because that's how you get your TOT, you have to understand first, what visits are there? What were they before? What are they likely to be now? And then don't go for the whole enchilada. Let's structure an attraction program and a support program that aims at that low-hanging fruit, because it's all about occupancy with a hotel. The night is gone when it's gone. You're never recapturing it. You've got to get the heads in the beds, and that means you got to figure out which heads are likely to be there earlier and come back quicker.
Yeah,
Great,
I'll quickly add to that. One thing that we've been doing, actually been doing hotel studies, and we want to look at a point in time pre-COVID. So the way to analyze hotel market is sort of look at it at pre-COVID levels and then a post-COVID. And the reason for the pre-COVID is you want to understand the real fundamentals of the market. I'm delivering a presentation Monday to a city council on a pre-COVID basis, meaning that the fundamentals were strong. So now we can kind of predict on a go-forward basis what to expect in terms of the comeback. If the fundamentals weren't strong pre-COVID, then we've got some different issues. But don't analyze current data because occupancies are at an unusual low.
Thank you. So while we're talking about TOT, quick question, I think, would a similar arrangement to a STAR be possible for hotels and jurisdictions that rely fairly heavily on TOT?
Yes.
We just didn't have a clever STAR for TOT. It was like STOT, STOT. So STAR, yes, it can be TOT, absolutely.
So it's sales tax assessment revenue, or it's really transient occupancy tax assessment revenue. TOTAR just didn't sound as good as STAR.
Awesome. Really quick, there were a couple questions as it relates to the COVID-19 and a potential vaccine. So let's say there's a vaccine in the next 12 months or so. How long do you think some of the trends that we're seeing now will last? And I think there are a few attendees that wonder how they can take the projections that you have and think about how best to make long-term decisions based on what will be hopefully short-term conditions. What are your thoughts there?
So first of all, the second part first, you really can't just take the data that we've given you. I think that's a baseline. Then you have to overlay your local components. What kind of hotels, what kind of retail, how much of each, what kind of residential sites do you have? I mean, that's the key. Listen, there is no silver bullet, I think, in terms of the vaccine. The vaccine is not likely to work for everyone. It is also a virus that will morph. So it will improve things. There's no doubt. I mean, but the strategic decisions that you make today have to, I think, be within the understanding that it's going to be an incremental recovery. So all of the data, all of the strategic tools we've given you, all of those questions and possible answers really come into play. You can't rely on just that one thing on a Monday. We have this vaccine and life is good again on Tuesday. It's just not going to be that way.
Well, that helps. Thank you. Let's just jump to some zoning questions. We've got one group that's saying that they're doing a general plan update that considers rezoning large shopping centers to potentially include housing. How can they do that without giving it away? And maybe I think it's a little bit more of an explanation on VOR.
Right.
How do you put density in the bucket, as you mentioned?
I know Ken will want to weigh in on this. Let me just start by saying you have right now a blank canvas. Right? You're starting down the road of a general plan or specific plan. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what are you willing to do with that canvas? What kind of painting do you want? What levels of density? What kinds of uses? Do you have an educational anchor in your community that can move to that center? Because that's a trip generator. Do you have an entertainment use that actually is outdoors oriented? Because that's a trip generator. So you have this blank canvas and you have to start thinking about, it's like remodeling a house. What do I want to do with the kitchen? What do I want to do with these rooms? You lay that out. Then you realize, after you do your economic analysis of every product type that you say you want there, then you know how much density you can give away to support that investment. And you can create that density layer, pre-approve it in your specific plan, technically put 600,000 square feet in a development opportunity bucket. It is a provision in your specific plan that says, we have 600,000 square feet approved. We will approve projects that accomplish the following or provide the following amenities, and then move to a development agreement for those projects that fulfill the density bonus requirements that you've set up through your plan. Ken?
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Larry, from a community benefit standpoint, the real key, which is what we did in Buellton, is obviously get the community involved. So through a series of our workshops, we had to really go to the community, get the public to come to those workshops, whether it's in person, online, or what have you, get their input. What's important to them? This is important to our community. And that's how we figured out what the trade-off was in Buellton when we did the Development Opportunity Reserve program in that specific plan. It works in a general plan, works in a specific plan, but the community has to weigh in on what's important. Therefore, you can create that trade-off, that quid pro quo between density and community benefit, and then there's a buy-in and transparency for that matter.
So while you bring up getting community support, there's a question about POBs and some negative sentiment surrounding those with taxpayers associations kind of pushing back. Any recommendations for getting public support?
Yeah, we go through this conversation. Look, first of all, it's not a 50-yard dash to go do POB. It's a very complicated analysis that has to start with the question, is it worth it? And is there more risk in doing this? Is there more risk that PERS will actually perform someday and some overpaying on the refinancing? We have a checklist of questions that we work through with our communities so we can responsibly assess those risk factors, because the audience that's out there that doesn't like POBs have some very good points. They're legitimate. Here's the thing. If you're facing $100 million in unfunded accrued liabilities and being charged 7%, and the market can give you that same debt at 3.5% taxable, isn't it worth asking and answering those questions to see if for you, as your community, from a risk profile, from a technical profile, and from a savings profile, is it worth going after? So there's no yes or no. There's just put it on the table and let's look at it. Now, you know that you have to validate these. If you're a city, you have to validate these POBs. You have to go to the court. The courts have been slower. So it's not a tomorrow solution. It's going to take you 6 or 7 months to get it done. Have the conversation now, be open with your community, answer the hard questions, and then make a decision. Because once you've said yes, if you do, you've got a 4 or 5 month court process. If you say no and you find a different way to restructure your debt, then you're that much farther ahead. It's having the conversation that's most important.
Okay, thank you. Here's a quick question about fees. Do you have any best practices for mitigating transportation impact fees to recruit for e-commerce and distribution?
Could you give me that question again? I think I might have missed a couple of words.
Any best practices for mitigating transportation impact fees so that you can recruit for e-commerce or distribution?
Yeah, look, I think that the defense against distribution has been to impose trip fees or density fees on those uses. I'm going to just answer it this way. I think it's when you start in that, when you give me that question, I think it's the wrong question, not to be disrespectful. I think the bigger question is, where's your retail now and what industrial or distribution uses are you being asked to approve, right? Because if that use, that industrial use is going to give you last mile delivery acceleration, which means goods are getting faster to your consumers in your local economy, then, and if you're understanding how the sales tax is going to emanate from that transaction, then it's not so much about the fee, it's more about what's the overall return on this investment? And then I can figure out if you deserve a fee. Maybe I ought to be paying you to put that facility in. I don't know. But we start from a world of, if it's retail, we love you. If it's industrial, we're going to look askance. And I don't think that's the proper perspective anymore. I think we have to balance how we look at this new industrial and say, you know what? I shouldn't just charge it because a truck is coming. Maybe I should just capture it because a truck is going somewhere to deliver a product that generates some sales tax for me. That's the difference. That's that doorstep, that drive-up economy, that last mile delivery economy. So tough question, because I think if you ask the question, you're on the wrong pathway. If you ask the question, what's the best way to evaluate an industrial use as opposed to a retail generator, then we figure out if the fees work. Let's see what it does for us first.
Awesome. Hey, thank you. I just want to do a quick time check. We are almost at 12:30, and if you gentlemen are able to stick around for a couple more minutes, we can stay on the line. Sure. We do have a couple more questions, so we will try and get through those. And for those of you, like I mentioned, that have put questions in the chat that we don't get to, we will make sure to share emails and contact info, so if the Cosmont team can reply, that they will do so. So jumping in very quickly, we have a question about opportunity zones, and we've talked about that before together, gentlemen. Costa Mesa's got an opportunity zone, and it's also, and then using the acronyms EDA, CEDS plan area, and a difficult to develop area. So the question that is asked is it beneficial to make an opportunity zone an EISD? And then second part of that is how can they engage their city and county public agencies in utilizing economic development incentives if they don't have in-house expertise?
Okay, well, the second one is easy. You can just hire someone like Cosmont, and we'd be glad to do the work. I do a little flip there, but look, there is expertise out there. Go, please find it. What you don't want to do is be, penny wise, dollar foolish. This is a time when economic development and public finance expertise, the merger of those two, are really key for you. So make sure you have it. Okay. So opportunity zones. I don't think Costa Mesa has a very huge opportunity zone, as I recall, but there are 879 opportunity zones in California. Let me just explain for a minute what they do. They allow those taxpayers who have a profit to invest in those areas and get a tax deferral for a period of time. And if they keep that investment for 10 years, they get a total tax escape, if you will, from any capital gains from the profit of that investment. So that means two things. One, the investment has to make sense. And number two, the timing has to make sense. In a pandemic market, most opportunity zone investors have been sitting like the other investors on the sideline looking for opportunities, right? Now, you asked the question about EIFD. If you form an EIFD and you overlay that EIFD onto an opportunity zone, there are a couple of things that you can do. One is you can essentially tell the opportunity zone investment that an investment in this area is going to get some value capture from the tax increment they create. That induces them and may bring them off the sidelines. Here's the most important thing. In places like Costa Mesa where zoning is challenging, what you can do under the new OZ provisions that are post-COVID, in response to COVID, the investment parameters and time for those investors have been extended to literally 3 to 5 years, depending on the circumstance. You can let those investors know that you're willing to change the zoning, you're willing to put that property in EIFD. They can park that money on a tax deferred basis for 3 to 5 years, and they can work with you to do a public-private deal. The opportunities to use OZ money today because of COVID, frankly, are better than they were pre-COVID. The comparison of an investment that's going to be attractive to an opportunity zone investor has the competition of the expectation that because of the pandemic, many other bargain investments will appear. So why should I do an OZ investment? That's your tension. And that's why there's never been a better time to improve OZ investment environment in local communities, because of the competition from other discounted deals that's expected by the private sector due to the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Really quickly, you talked about entitlements as currency. That was something that in one of your slides, and I think you probably know this, but what are your thoughts about the pieces of legislation that the legislature is considering that could override the local zoning and allow for housing on sites that are zoned for office or for retail? Thoughts about how that impacts sort of your strategy that you're proposing here?
Oh, look, I never liked the state imposing zoning on local government. I'm a former city manager. Ken and I work with so many communities. It's not something we like. We think zoning is somewhat nuanced for every local community, but this is a gift in wolf's clothing, and I'll tell you why. Think about this. You have a 60-acre, like Ken will talk about Laguna Hills. You have a 60-acre center. Some of it's going residential because you saw our dashboards. Residential was one of the few hot products. The land residual value per unit for residential is going up. The square foot value for retail is going down. If the state says, I'm handing you zoning that's worth more, take it and go negotiate a deal that gets you what you want on the rest of the 60 acres. It just gave you bankable currency. So yeah, I get excited when Sacramento, wakes up and says you should do it this way or that way. Here's what I think. The repositioning of malls that comes out of the pandemic COVID is the best response to SB 50 we have. It gives us the most control. And I invite the state to go impose that zoning on us, because I think with folks like us on your team, we'll turn that currency around and get what we want on those 60 acres. We'll use that value. Ken, you may have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a way to use sort of our sales tax assessment strategy to also within a development agreement negotiation, which we've talked about, but that's a way to also basically get your cake and eat it too. So
Correct.
the question, first of all, is what's the fiscal impact? And we're doing plenty of these to a blended use project. You have office, you have retail, you have a little bit of retail, you have residential, you might have hospitality, and it's really what's the fiscal impact of all of those combined. You used to have a homogeneous district of retail or a large center, and now you've got to reevaluate what's the fiscal impact. Once you do that, then it's the opportunity to negotiate and use the tools that we've talked about where there's a public-private transaction. It's got to be win-win. The private sector sort of financial pro forma still needs to be able to work, but the city's fiscal impact pro forma, if you will, needs to be able to work. So you assess the sales tax, you assess the tax revenue, and then you negotiate a win-win transaction that then ends up being part of an agreement that's mutually agreeable to both parties on a go-forward basis. That's the way to start looking at these things, and they're going to be so commonplace because we're in the middle of so many of these things. And you talk about entitlements, many of these sites are going to get re-entitled. Many of these sites are going to get negotiated between the public and private sectors. Many of these sites are going to need these tools and really a creative thought process in order to bring them to fruition. By the way, they don't happen overnight. There's a long time to negotiate these deals, and then there's a long time before they're going to ultimately become this blended use project that we're looking for. So that's why my point before was, don't put your head in the sand today. You don't, I call it the ostrich strategy. Don't put your head in the sand today. It's the right time to be thinking and negotiating and actually thinking about the re-entitlement of a lot of land uses.
Awesome, thank you. Just two more questions, I think. We talked in the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about the sectors and potential recovery timeframes and horizons. Can you talk a little bit about the future of what you think the entertainment industry is from both the home and Netflix perspective, as well as the live and entertainment sports perspective in the context of this larger discussion?
So our discussion, it's all about, I think here's where the bucket that I throw sports entertainment in, and that's with airline travel. It is the same philosophical and emotional response. This is a consumer-based economy. When comfort exists sufficient to support the level of planes we had in the air pre-COVID, we would have captured that market back. We have the same issue with sporting events, and we have the same issue with entertainment events. Now, those are complicated businesses that have, digital alternatives. We just saw Disney provide Hamilton over the weekend for Disney Plus. I mean, these are really good strategic moves. These are very smart companies, but the consumer decides, and we can't really rush that. So it is some combination of cleanliness theater, of a vaccine that has some capability of working in a reasonable period of time, and organized processes for utilization, safe distancing, sanitation, all of those things that really are going to make it incrementally better to come back and use these venues. But make no mistake, I mean, the NBA's experiment in Florida will be a big petri dish for all of us, but it's still a petri dish that's absent an audience. And so it'll be an incremental comeback. My sense is you've got to focus on the other areas of your economy first, as we said earlier, because I think they're lower hanging fruit. I mean, it's going to be hard to recapture those economic engines quickly. That's just a byproduct of where we are.
That's actually a perfect segue to I think what our last question will be. And it's given all of this change, all of these adjustments that we're constantly evaluating, what will be the future metrics to measure the health of the business community? How can we take what we know now when this is our new normal?
Yeah, so I think the metrics of the new normal are different metrics, and they already started shifting. For example, Ken and I started to tell our communities years ago that you measure a success of retail, not in terms of retail per square foot sales, but in terms of trips, because trips generate sales. So what I'm here to say is I think your fundamental metrics are changing. So we have to figure those out. Number two, again, we can't expect, to recapture all of the the hotel viability immediately. So we have to do that incrementally. And so that more refined strategy is going to come to play for those of us that are really looking to shore up our hotel returns. On the retail side, that's different. If I could urge you today to leave this with a couple of messages, it's don't lead with retail. It's like leading with your face. You can't do it. It's not a retail-based recovery anymore. It's a blended use-based recovery, which means point number two, don't surcharge industrial and hide behind a transit fee, because it may be the wrong answer. When you put one and two together, you're into a different product mix. We could have industrial sitting essentially in industrial use for goods storage sitting in vacant space in retail centers, because it gives the retailers that are left the ability to provide immediate delivery of goods on site. Take that Brooks Brothers store that's going away and fill it with merchandise for someone else. I mean, so rule number one, really don't give away your zoning. Don't say no to industrial, because these are kinds of things that we can change the metric response to our investment results and to the private sector results. We just don't know all the metrics yet. We do know that things are changing, and we do know that if we downplay retail because the demand is less, and we increase and focus on those last mile delivery facilities and those residential units that are still in demand, we might be able to shore up our retail and make the fall much more palatable, make the balance of result much more equitable going forward. Ken, you may want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just give State Street Santa Barbara as an example. We worked on a study there, 10 blocks of pretty consistent, long-standing retail, very successful historically. Our conclusion is that 10 blocks of retail, storefront retail, was not viable in the future. It's unfortunate, but State Street Santa Barbara is facing, as an iconic destination, the fact that all 10 blocks of those cannot be refilled, as it's experiencing vacancy, cannot be refilled with the like kind of product type and activity that had in the past. So Amazon came in as an office user and took on a vacant Saks Fifth Avenue space, 50,000 square feet. There's a vacant Macy's there. We heard that Nordstrom's may be leaving. So what happens to all those spaces? Well, if you were to shrink down the 10 blocks, and maybe it's not in one spot, but shrink down the 10 into 5 blocks, I'm just making it up, close part of the street, you will have 5 blocks of very healthy retail left. You will have office and residential that could permeate and synergize that retail that's left. And now you have 3 different product types, including hospitality, make it a 4th. You have 4 product types that actually can all be healthy when they work together. But it's not 10 blocks of the same thing. It's not 60 acres of the same thing. So that's what I would add to that concept. You're trying to strengthen the retail that makes sense. And then you've got to really think creatively about, can there be some version of an industrial use? Can there be some residential, again, with a fiscal impact that's actually positive once you do a combined analysis? Can there be some office and creative office that put daytime population into environments that didn't have it before? But the 10 blocks of retail on State Street Santa Barbara cannot end up being the same thing. Kind of like Einstein said, you can't fix the problem with the same problem that was used to create the problem, right? The thought process has to change.
Thank you so much. We talked so much today about revolution and opportunity, innovation, collaboration, creativity. I think those themes came out very, very strongly today, gentlemen. I appreciate the lively discussion and all of those of you that are still on the phone. So as we wrap up today, I do want to give our 2 panelists a chance to close out with any additional insights before we move to our next slide about follow-up and how you can stay connected with us.
Yeah, 3 quick insights. Please don't give away your zoning anymore, number 1. Number 2, figure out, someone asked about metrics. Get to understand that the metrics of land value for retail are going south and the metrics of land value for residential are going north. There's a currency swap that can work to your advantage. Don't be afraid of legislation necessarily that pushes other uses than retail. Take the currency swap and use it to your advantage. And then number 3, public outreach. Everyone has a different set of lenses to about what's going on. And people are just fundamentally scared. They're scared for the kids. They're scared for themselves. They have businesses that they've invested their whole lives in, and they're trying to figure out what's the next chapter. In a world of uncertainty, all of us are leaders that are in local government. In a way, we're heroes, I think. So to be the right kind of hero, it's really a function of getting out there and having the conversation. The change is not necessarily depletive, that the opportunity still exists for our communities if we work together and make the right decision. It sounds idealistic, but we can't be battered by the notion that we have a revolution going on. We can be, I think, energized as communities to make the most of it. But the first thing is we just have to roll up our sleeves and go to work. So my final message here is time is now. You spent 4 months just sort of putting out some fires, but time is now to engage your community, engage your leadership, have this conversation. Let's put retail, let's put residential, let's put hotel, let's put it all on the table, industrial, and paint those product types in the true colors that exist for them today, both in terms of metrics, demand, likelihood of return, likelihood of dissipation. We have to be honest, and then let's figure out a future for our community, and let's move forward for your benefit. Use that zoning tool, use that entitlement tool, use your low-cost debt tool, and put them to work once you've answered the questions and after you've had that conversation with your community. If you move in front of them, it'll get dour for you. If you bring them along and say there's a bright future ahead, but let's understand how to get to a bright future together.
I love that. Thank you so much for thinking about how we reimagine our communities and how we connect the dots with those that live where we work. Randy Kay, would you advance to the next slide? We do hope that you will stay connected with ILG and all of our partners. We continue to develop programs and resources around the wide range of issues like this one that are impacting cities, counties, and special districts. These are all of our social media handles. And we do push out social media regularly that includes our webinars and other free resources. We do occasional e-news alerts and monthly newsletters, and we do quantity over quality, quality over quantity. So please make sure to sign up with us. Next slide. And the recording for this webinar will be available soon. We'll share electronically with everyone who registered for our session today. Next slide. This concludes our webinar, actually, and I really want to thank Ken and Larry and our webinar co-host of CSAC. We know how absolutely unprecedented this crisis is and how busy you all are kind of navigating that for your clients and for local agencies. So thank you for your time today and the extra time today, certainly. And for those of you that registered, thank you, and for staying on, so many of you as well, even though we ran a little long. Your questions were fantastic. It has been an honor for you to join us. And on behalf of the entire team at ILG, thank you and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Randy Kay.
Great.